Dating back to 1903, the Chamber of Commerce had decided that Cleveland needed to be more than just a prosperous town. It was the general consensus that the city was in need of a cultural identity in order to be recognized as a worthy destination in the East. By 1943, the City Planning Council was formed, which is one of the driving forces for urban renewal in Cleveland throughout the 1950s and 1960s. 1949 was one of the most monumental years for urban renewal in Cleveland. Not only was the official plan for the city of Cleveland created, but there were also 3 pieces of legislation that favored the urban planners. This included the Federal Housing Act, the Ohio Urban Redevelopment Act, and the Wagner-Ellender-Taft Housing Act. Together, these acts allowed the planners to receive government funding and were supposed to ensure that citizens were not displaced from home due to demolition.
In 1953 brought about the creation of the Cleveland Development Foundation, which was charged with the task of planning the renewal projects. By 1954, they had appointed Upshur Evans as the president, and racial tensions began to heat up. Evans then released a statement saying that the areas chosen for demolition had nothing to do with social issues, but rather a simple business decision. The Erie View project was introduced to Cleveland in the early 1960s as a plan to remove blighted areas from the city. The idea gained much support throughout local officials and community leaders. It consisted of 2 parts. The first part contained plans to reconstruct commercialized areas, and the second part focused on residential. 1961 marked the beginning of demolition of over 126,000 homes around Cleveland. The city had proceeded with these demolitions without giving the citizens a chance to voice their opinions. Although the land was cleared and ready for construction, the Erie View plan was never finished. The tower was completed, but the residential part of the plan was never attempted. Cleveland was unable to acquire enough funding in order to complete the second part of the Erie View project, which left thousands of citizens without a home.
Within the first year of the tower's completion, a majority of the white population began moving from the city out to the neighboring suburbs. Meanwhile, the African American population increased within the city and accounted for extremely crowded housing situations. Similarly, public schools were overflowing with roughly 135,000 students throughout Cleveland. Programs that were instituted to assist overcrowding were harmful to African American students' educations.
They were convinced that the race was a leading cause for the Reconstruction due to the fact that mostly African Americans were left displaced.
Segregation within schools was more prominent than it had ever been before. Many poor black families were forced to relocate to Huff, which was the most blighted area of Cleveland. The percentage of black residents in Huff went from 14% in 1950 to 75% in 1960. 70,000 people were forced to live within 2 square miles, and racial tensions were increasing on a daily basis.
With the forced relocation of low-class citizens to surrounding neighborhoods, the ghettos became overpopulated. Huff was a neighborhood within Cleveland that was a major source for poverty and crime. In the spring of 1966, the United States Civil Rights Commission held meetings in Cleveland determined to resolve the poverty crisis. After 7 days, they came to the conclusion that Huff's problems were the classic ones of the ghetto. These issues included inadequate housing, schools, and jobs.
A group of 50 black community leaders approached Mayor Locker to express their opinions regarding new urban development. There were plans for another project to expand Cleveland State University, which would cost several $1,000,000. There was no apparent hurry to construct new living units, as only 30,000 were made between 1950 and 1967. This compares to 150,000 units being constructed within the suburbs. These patterns affected Huff, as whites would continue to move out of the city, the success of the urban renewal programs in the ghetto was virtually non-existent.
In 1955, demolition began in the central neighborhood's Longwood district. This signaled the beginning of an era of urban renewal throughout the city. The renewal continued, and by 1958 there were 800 housing units, new streets, and a playground that had been completed in the area. Although the plan seemed to be working well, citizens who have become displaced remain disgruntled.
On July 18, 1966, the Huff riots began after a group of white kids ganged up on a young African American. Word spread and other blacks within the community arrived to help the cause. These riots gained national attention and continued until the National Guard arrived for assistance.
15 people were injured, and one woman died from the police brutality towards the minorities. This was the breaking point for the citizens of Huff, for the racism they felt had been worsening over time. The people of Huff were rebelling against racism and the entrapment within the ghetto.
In 1967, Carl Stokes was elected mayor of Cleveland, which marked the first time that an African American was elected mayor of a major U.S. city. This was a turning point in the unfair treatment that was experienced by African Americans within the city, as they finally received attention on the political spectrum. The election of Stokes resulted in new plans that cleaned up the inner city as opposed to rebuilding it. The program was called the Cleveland Now program and was both privately and publicly funded. This was essential for the city of Cleveland as they began to take steps in the right direction for prosperity and racial equality.
Carl was able to win the support of the African American community as well as a large portion of the white community who were tired of all the segregation. African Americans became more satisfied with the politicians' decisions. Crime rates went down and police brutality was rarely seen. With the help of Mayor Stokes, the Cleveland City Planning Commission set in stone a 10-year plan for Cleveland renewal. The plan primarily focused on poverty, living conditions, and everyday life in the inner city. The failed attempts of multiple Cleveland renewal projects led to years of increased segregation along with serious financial concerns. In 1973, $1.5 million were recommended for demolition, the largest in Cleveland history. Just 5 years later, Cleveland was unable to repay $14 million in loans due to these urban renewal projects and became the first city to become bankrupt since the Depression.
After further examining urban renewal during the mid-20th century in Cleveland, it is clear to see that race was the overwhelming reason for the failure of multiple renewal projects. By polarizing African Americans through displacement, the proposed plans for the city were unable to be fulfilled. It caused upheaval throughout the city and encouraged segregation.
Although the election of an African American mayor benefited the racial tensions, it could never fully heal the troubles caused by the everlasting reconstruction in the city. With the absence of low-income housing available, inner city families had no choice but to believe the business plans of Cleveland were severely flawed. In 2012, the Erie View Tower faced foreclosure as it could still not maintain a proper funding to thrive. Citizens in Cleveland to this day are still affected by the lack of housing, while many nearby suburbs are constantly growing in population.